Welcome, everyone, to the 2025 SIT seminar. My name is Reverend Darnell Fennell, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of Social Entrepreneurship here at the National Benevolent Association, also known as NBA for short. And NBA is the Health and Social Service Ministry of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. And on behalf of our entire team, I bring you greetings and welcome. We're so glad you've joined us in this virtual space. And for those who will watch these videos at a later time, we're looking forward to leaning into meaningful content, deep conversations, and practical strategies for social entrepreneurship. This year's theme is called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Building Impactful Futures. And this comes, my friends, at a critical time as we just look around at what's going on in our country as DEI is increasingly politicized and even dismissed in some circles. Those serving historically marginalized communities face new challenges, especially around funding and creating cultures of equity and belonging. However, as people of faith, we choose to honor our call to continue to live into this world, this work, no matter what the consequences may be, but having the wisdom and understanding on how to navigate this changing landscape. We chose this theme to equip leaders with courage and practical strategies to keep holding up the light of DEI, even when it's unpopular. At NBA, we're also on our own equity journey, sitting alongside you as you work together toward a more just and impactful world. With that grounding, it is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Reverend Rebecca Jackson. Rebecca is a clinically trained facilitator, teacher, consultant, and coach through Love Seed. Rebecca applies her decades of leadership and teaching experience in supporting mission-driven organizations to strengthen their equity practice. Rebecca creates space where people can have difficult but necessary conversations to learn, to grow, and to thrive. She builds loving, sustainable, and brave leaders, teams, and organizations that bring their equity values to life. They have dedicated their work to advancing equity in ways that don't just change structures, but also transform communities. Their vision for leadership and justice aligns perfectly with our theme of building impactful futures. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Jackson, our keynote speaker for 2025 SIT Seminar Week 1.
Thank you, Darnell. It's such a pleasure to be able to be with you all this evening. At least it's an evening. I'm in Boston, Massachusetts, so it's evening where I am, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk openly about you'll see me do air quotes with DEI because I often will refer to it as equity work or inclusion work. And as Darnell said in his introduction, we know the ways in which that work is being politicized these days, and I dare say demonized in a lot of ways. And so I often will not necessarily use the letters because I think that is part of the way that we've been able to divorce the practice and the work of equity from its real life impact when we, sort of put initials behind things. So I will sometimes say DEI, I will sometimes say equity work. And, when I got this invitation, and I was really grateful for the opportunity to talk about equity. And I'm a little bit of a storyteller. I suppose I'm a preacher's kid, and so that's somewhat in my DNA. And I thought about, like, I sometimes say when I introduce myself, I teach social work students, and I sometimes say, I've been doing equity work my whole life. I'm a Black woman in the United States, and I was a Black girl in the United States, and I grew up in a mostly white neighborhood and went to mostly white schools. And so for me, race is something that's all, and I went to a Black church. My dad is a pastor, and our church was mostly Black and was in a very different sort of neighborhood and area than the one that I grew up in. So I've always kind of had this experience of having to navigate my constant identity, but how it sort of shifted depending on where I was. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own kind of personal experience, and definitely invite those of you who are watching to pop into the chat and answer some questions. I get tired of my own voice if I listen to it for too long. So would love to be able to engage with folks and interact with folks and hear about how my story and my experience is resonating with you and with yours. So the first time that I remember having an experience of feeling somewhat excluded was when I was in the first grade. So I'm the child of a librarian. My dad was a lawyer, is a pastor. Thanks, Zane. And my mom taught me how to read pretty early. So by the time I went to kindergarten, I knew how to read at least a little bit. And when I was in the first grade, I did. And so my teacher would send me across the hall to a second grade classroom for their reading time. And we don't tell anybody, but we in my family, we called that teacher Miss Neville the Devil because it was pretty clear to me, even as a 6 year old, that she didn't really want me there. And I don't know if I knew why. And I think even now, 41 years later, it would be hard for me to kind of articulate exactly what it was. And those of you who are watching and listening who have different marginalized identities, you can probably relate to this feeling of like, not quite knowing why you don't fit in or why you're not wanted or you feel not wanted, not being able to kind of put your fingers on it. Yet that feeling and that experience is very real. And so my mom, they at the end of the year, I guess they were towards the end of the year, they talked about me skipping a grade. And I have this sort of vague, ambiguous memory of my mom kind of being really clear that they did not want me to advance to the third grade and that she wasn't going to let them stop me or stop her. So I did end up getting skipped to the third grade. And I had a Black third grade teacher, Mrs. Sherwood, and I had a Black first grade teacher, Miss Rickenbacker. And I often wonder, and I've done some work in schools, and many of us know the statistics about exposure to a teacher. In particular, I think I'm going to botch it a little bit, but there's a statistic about the likelihood if a Black boy is being more likely to drop out of school if they don't have a Black teacher by, I forget if it's the third grade or the fifth grade, it might even be the eighth grade, but we need representation, right? I mean, that's part of what diversity is. That's part of what inclusion is being able to see ourselves reflected in the people who are in positions of power. And so for me, and of course, at the age of 6, I wasn't thinking about what I would be one day in terms of being an equity practitioner or, anything like that. But it did imprint in me the importance of advocacy. And my mom was an advocate for me and she stood up for me. She had my back. It's a privilege that she did. She had the time, she had the access, she had the resources to be able to go up to the school and sort of fight for me. And it's something that I have kept as sort of a North Star, as a guiding value, the importance of being able to advocate for people who look like me, being able to advocate for young people, being able to be a sort of a beacon, that if I'm here, if I'm in this position, then that means that there is room and space for you. And that I, as a Black woman, am always thinking about how I can create a more inclusive environment and help other leaders and organizations create more inclusive environments for marginalized people. And I often say that, if a space is safe and healthy and healing for a Black girl like me, then it's safe and healthy and healing for everyone. So that was in early memory. And I'd love to hear if other folks have any sort of early memories that you can think of and kind of drop into the chat of times that you may have felt excluded, and maybe you also don't necessarily have the full language to be able to articulate what it was, but that it's something that felt really clear to you. And that experience for me was, like I said, an imprint on the importance of advocacy and the importance of really representing. And I do wonder sometimes if I hadn't had a Black first grade teacher and a Black third grade teacher to kind of buffer that time in my life, how things might have been a little bit different for me. And so I feel really grateful that I had those women and my mom, who was really my first DEI practitioner that made sure that there was room and that I was included in the spaces that I deserved to be included in, because I deserved to be able to be moved ahead because I was able to achieve at that level. And so that's like sort of my childhood DEI exposure or experience. But when I think about how I started it professionally and thinking about some of the lessons that I started to learn really early, it was when I was in grad school as a social work student. And I noticed that we weren't talking about race in my classes, that we were training to be clinicians, and that we weren't talking about the race of our clients. At least other people weren't. I was. And that, when I think about those of us who are doing this work, the skills to be able to talk, the language, realizing that the ways in which that was really uneven was such an important lesson for me, and one that I have kept, that has continued to stay with me, the importance of language and really being able to understand that people who have a lot of privilege, and we can sort of broaden it beyond race too, and say that whatever your dominant identities are, you probably don't have the language to talk about them. You are not skilled in being able to have conversation about that, and if we can't have conversation about it, then we can't make any moves, we can't take any action. So the realization at that point, and because what I decided to do, because I tend to be a woman who it takes action, was I started a group. I was a grad school student. I started a group to, I think we called it diversity dialogues. And it was really just a space for us to talk about why it was hard for us to talk about race. And I don't think I realized how difficult it was in that instance, how difficult it was for white people to just talk about race. But again, they didn't have the practice that I had, and that other people of color had. They didn't have the skill set, to be able to have those conversations. And so I had to slow down. I had to really kind of slow down what I thought we would be able to do, and be able to back up a little bit and understand that everyone is not in the same place. And when I think about the work that I do as well in organizations, doing equity work, doing inclusion work, the importance of everybody being on the same page with a basic understanding, and building people's skill level to just be able to have the conversation and sort of name what needs to be named, is a really early lesson that I learned, again, in as a grad school student who was really aware of the importance of our own privilege and biases, and the ways that that was going to show up in our clinical work and in our work with individuals. And I was kind of like, well, if we're not talking about it here in the classroom, that's supposed to be sort of a safe learning space, then we're probably not talking about it with our clients, and they might want to. That might be something that's really important to them, that they want to have some conversation about. And these people don't seem like they're going to be able to have that conversation, and that felt really important to me. So that was kind of an early lesson for me about that was 14, 15 years ago. And honestly, it's continued to be something that has been important and somewhat difficult, is to remember that everyone is not in the same place, and that getting people kind of at the same starting point is an important piece of being able to do work that is sustaining and sustainable, and that has an impact long term. A colleague of mine who I worked with for a number of years, and a friend, we were doing some organizational work. And often, in the line of work that I'm in, I get called into places when there's a problem. People, unfortunately, for people don't always want a DEI practitioner or an inclusion practitioner when everything is great. It's when things aren't going so great that they realize that they might need some help. And my colleague said, we have to move at the speed of trust, not the speed of harm. And it's so tempting, in particular, as a Black woman who has a personal investment in this work, and in, the effectiveness and the impact of this work, to want to come in and move pretty quickly to try to fix things and address things. And when you say, we have to sort of slow down and move at the speed of trust, sometimes I'm like, what trust? There's no trust. Well, we have to build it. And I think that's another kind of lesson that I want to highlight for folks, is the importance of slowing down, that it can be so easy to get caught up in the urgency of the moment, and especially the moment that we are in right now as a society. But moving quickly often backfires for us because we often will realize that, oh, we didn't have this sort of fundamental thing. We're not on the same page about language. We don't have the same understanding about frameworks. We don't have the same understanding about what we're not even talking about the same thing. And being able to kind of slow down and really take the time to understand where people are coming from, taking the time to build relationships among whatever that group is, and not making assumptions about what people do and don't know and where they are, has been, to be perfectly honest with you, a really painful lesson, but a very important one. I was in a meeting today with one of the clients that I work with, and they were talking, the president was talking about a board meeting that she was sort of doing a report on the board meeting, and she said, so going through the agenda, she said we start with a check-in and a mindful moment, and I thought, oh, I introduced that to them 5 or 6 years ago, and it's something that they are still doing. And I remember working with this group, this sort of subcommittee of a board, and just knowing that where that board was, they needed to just start with the real basics, and that the basics were having a relationship, building relationships, building in time for connection, and having the skill to be able to breathe and be, quiet and sort of connect with their bodies. And I, if you had asked me then, probably I would have been like, yeah, well, I don't really know how much we did, and how much I got done, and it was, we had to just sort of had to be where they were. And knowing years later that that is something that has stuck with them and that they're still doing was really a powerful moment. But again, I had to sort of resist um, my urge, my desire, my tendency to kind of go in and try to super turbo fix things, and really slow down and have a clear understanding of where people are. So I'm going to actually pause there, and I'm curious. I would love to hear people's thoughts and reactions in the chat, and I'll be quiet for a minute. Yes, I did not make that up. I will give Simone John her credit for that. Working at the speed of trust, not at the speed of harm. Yeah, it's a good one. I'm curious again to hear in the chat other folks' experiences of, getting into a situation or trying to work with a group of people where maybe you realize that, oh, we're actually not speaking the same language, we don't have the same understanding, needing to slow down and kind of realizing that. Curious if that resonates with other people, or if other people also resonate with how challenging that can be, in particular as somebody who feels really invested in the work and in. Yeah, Kelly, it does resonate, absolutely. Thank you. Curious if it's resonating for other people as well. And I will also say, while giving people the opportunity to drop their thoughts in the chat, that I, again, often get called into situations where there's some kind of fire. And I do a lot of work around facilitation and teaching people how to facilitate, doing facilitation workshops. I say facilitation is my love language, and that good facilitation will save the world. And what I've often found is that when there is fear and reticence about engaging in a conversation about equity, where people are talking about identity and their identity differences, et cetera, that it was often a misstep in facilitation that led to the situation in the first place. That people will say, well, we had this facilitator who came in and they just, gave us a bunch of tools, or they didn't stop, and, they could tell that things were quiet, or people were quiet or silent or whatever, and they didn't say anything. They just kind of kept going, or they moved too fast or whatever. And, I saw, Kelly, I think you said that it's really hard to slow down. We're often under pressure. That pressure is internal and it's also external. And so it can be really hard to kind of stand my ground and say, nope, we're going to take the first hour of this workshop, or we're going to take the first half of this workshop or this retreat, and we're going to do this, relationship building activity, and we're going to have an in-depth check-in, and we're going to do these things, because otherwise we are not going to be able to do quote unquote the work that needs to be done, but also that is the work. The relationship building, the checking in, the getting to know each other, the understanding each other's full humanity, that is part of the work. And I had to be able to shift over the years in the way that I talk about it, so that I was talking about it in a way that was like, no, 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 we're working. This time that we are spending together, that's building relationships and that's connecting, you're going to need that. And leaving aside the DEI of it all, we can also all relate to having some type of a rupture with a friend, or a colleague. And when we have some relational capital, some social capital with them, it's so much easier to come back from that. I work with, and this is another thing that I think is really important that I learned the hard way, is that I often co-facilitate with white people. And I'm so blessed and fortunate to be able to have a couple of white women colleagues who have become friends, who I trust to be able to engage in this work with me. And I trust that they can hold some of the stuff. White people need to be doing this work with other white people. There's definitely a space and a time and an opportunity for mixed race and sort of multicultural work. But there is also a really important time for each, different groups of people being able to do their work separately. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying about starting it, having different starting points. And that sometimes being in, and I bet people can relate to this, being in a group where, it's a mixed race group. And as a person of color, you hear somebody say something that's painful, right? That, like, it's just where they are. They're not trying to be harmful. They're not trying to hurt your feelings, but you hear them say something and it's painful to think about. I remember doing a group years ago. We were talking about socialization, and we were talking about, like, how did you learn how to be yourself, right? Like, where did you, and this woman said, well, I don't really know what messages I got. White woman said, I don't really know what messages I got about being white. And I was like, I was leading the group, so I couldn't really react too hard to it. But that's, if I was in that group as a person of color, I mean, I was in that group, but I was leading it, that would be something that might be hard for me to hear and to take in. And so being able to do separate sort of race-based work, I think, is really an important part of the sort of slowing down piece, and being able to let people be where they are, right? Being able to understand that people are at different points in their lives, and have different skill sets. And, honestly, to be able to sort of not take that personally. I'm just looking at some of the things in the chat. Slowing down is hard to do. Trying to enter into space with urgency and responsiveness. Yes. Pushing to slow down and assess. That was a very early lesson for me too, because what part of what I learned was that leaders who are often the last to know that there's a problem, are the ones who get to diagnose the problem first. And so they will call me and say, oh, we need to do this, we need to do that. And I learned the hard way to say, we actually don't know what we need to do yet. We need to take some time. We need to slow down. I want to do some listening sessions. I want to talk to the people, and I want to hear about what's going on with the people, so that I can then, create a curriculum, or figure out what the interventions are that are actually going to be appropriate for this group, because the leader is in a different position. They're not trying to be um, obtuse, but they see things differently because of the position that they are in. Carolyn says, I've always felt something but couldn't put my thoughts around it. My parents would just say everyone is different. I was growing when I could put a name to what I was experiencing and why. Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate the naming of the difficulty with both being able to name things. I one of the jobs that I had when I was in grad school was I was a nanny. I'm an auntie. I love taking care of kids and other people's kids. And this boy, I was working for a white family in a pretty wealthy suburb outside of Boston, and this little boy came in, had been at the house for a play date, and as he was leaving, he said to his mom, white boy, white family, Mommy, that lady's African American, sort of whispered it. And she said, that ironically, his first name was Jackson. She said, Jackson, that's not nice. And how would you did it? So they're walking out the door, and clearly she's embarrassed that this boy has named what is a fact. I am African American. So I looked at the woman, the mom that I was working for, and I was like, I am African American. And we sort of chuckled about it. But it was such an important moment for me. And I'm sure that there are lots of people in this call who have kids, how we can sometimes silence kids from just naming what's true. That lady's in a wheelchair. Don't say that. That's not nice. Well, she's in a wheelchair. It's just a fact. It's just an observation. Kids are trying to make sense of the world, and that's it, putting language to it. But we often will sort of squelch that, and then we see that show up later, like I think your name is Carolyn, was saying. We see that show up later with a skill deficit. Like I was taught my whole life that it was rude to name someone's race, and now you're telling me that I need to say it, I need to talk about it, that I need to name my own race. I always, when I'm in a group, especially in a new group, I always have people introduce themselves with their race, ethnicity, and pronouns. And people still are like, well, I don't really know what to say. I had a student try to not say it. She was like, well, obviously, like, you could see what I am. And I was like, no, sis. No, you need to say it, because there are plenty of people, plenty of Latinas who are white passing. Like, we don't want to just make assumptions. You need to get comfortable with naming it, and you also need to not be making assumptions or assuming that other people are making assumptions about your racial identity. And we need to be able to just be comfortable naming it. And I find that even that can be sort of a radical act for people. I'm running out of time, and so the sort of two last things that I want to say. One is related to this other conversation, which is the importance of tools and frameworks, and the backside of them. So when you talk about getting people on the same page, being able to name things, being able to have common language of sort of across a team or an organization or a group of people, I have found that to be so helpful, because one of the ways that I think people avoid the work of real equity and inclusion is by saying, well, how will we really know? It's really complicated. Da, 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 da. They sort of wave their hands and throw their hands up, and people are always going to have an issue. And so I have found that being able to have sort of a continuum. I remember discovering, I think Crossroads has an anti-racist organization continuum, and it's just right there. Like, here's what an exclusive organization looks like, here's what an inclusive organization looks like. Boom, there you go. That's the plus, is being able to just have something that we can sort of name. The backside of that, at least that I have found, is that often, and again, talking specifically about race, but if you broaden it outside of that too, people want a roadmap. That's how part of how white supremacy works, is just tell me what to do, Rebecca. Just give me some steps. I have a team that I'm working with that I've been, encouraging them to do work with them for years, and encouraging them to do some reflection on how white supremacy culture shows up for them. And they're like, you asked us this question already. And I'm like, well, obviously, y'all need to answer it again, because we're not getting into the nitty gritty of what we need to be getting into. They just want steps. They're like, well, we just need some action. Action is important. Action steps are important. And also, this work is spiritual, as we all know. This work is personal, it is internal. In order to do it well and do it with sustainability, it requires self reflection, it requires introspection, it requires humility. It's heart work, it's personal, it's spiritual. So figuring out how to balance between, we need tools and we need frameworks, and I believe deeply in that. And also, there's a part of this work that's organic, and that's internal, and that's reflective. Holding those two, I find to be important and also challenging. And there's no formula for that, right? Like, part of that is just really being able to sort of flow with the group. And I think there can be sometimes resistance to that, both external and internal. And then the last thing I want to say before I close, and I think Darnell will open up for questions, is it is so important. And unfortunately, maybe this is, I don't know, me, the middle child of me, I often learn lessons the hard way. And my mom said a hard head makes for a soft behind, whatever. Um, the last thing that I want to say is, it is so important to not do this work alone. It is so important to have a team, to have a community. That might not be, I'm so blessed that I have had co-workers, colleagues, co-chairs, in particular white women who I really trust to be in the work with me, and also other Black women, other people of color to be able to be in community and in solidarity with. We cannot do this work alone and isolated. It absolutely has to be done in partnership and community. Sometimes we need to go find that. Sometimes we need to go look for it. It might not be the person who you work alongside of. It might be somebody in a different organization, somebody in a different church, somebody in a different, in a different place. But there are people out there who are like-minded, who can be in community with us, who can be in solidarity with us, and who can kind of share the burden. Otherwise, I think we will burn out, we will get discouraged, we will be ineffective. We, especially as a person who does work independently, it's so easy to just kind of get caught up in my own bubble, my own experiences, and to not be reaching out for or regularly getting reflection and feedback and mirroring and things like that, which is so important. The way that white supremacy works, the way that this capitalism, patriarchy, like name all the systems of oppression, they thrive when we are isolated. They thrive when we are not in community. And so one of the best, I think, tools for us as practitioners, but also to be able to impart to the people that we're working with, is the importance of community and figuring out how to be in healthy relationship with one another. And that in and of itself is just the foundational sort of bedrock of being able to do effective inclusion work. That I care about you. I want you to feel. I want your opinion to be a part of this. I want to weigh in. I want this space, this building, this initiative, this business. I want it to be reflective of you because I care about you, and my fate is bound up with yours. And so whatever end it is that we're working in, sort of as the practitioner, or and as the people that we're working with, helping them to build community, being able to model that. That's one of the beautiful things my friend, colleague, and I were just talking about the other day, why we do this work in a biracial dyad. Part of it is that we're trying to model. We want to model the beauty of having cross-racial, diverse relationships, and that is, from my perspective, the most important way to do this work. So don't do this work alone. Find community, find partnerships, find a team, find people who can be in it with you, because otherwise it is, I would say, impossible for us to be able to do this alone. So thank you for this time. Those are some of my lessons in 47/20 years of doing DEI work in various spaces. Thank you all for listening and for engaging in the chat. And sorry that I didn't get to see everything that everyone said.
Reverend Jackson, we want to thank you for your time of reflection, offering some tools and some uh, practical steps on what one could do as it relates to embodying and engaging the work of DEI. But I think beyond just looking at it from tools and skills, this is also faith formation, that those who are Christians, people of faith, that this is us living out our faith as well, then we are being formed by these practices, as difficult as they may be, to want to slow down and to want to go slow and to not be in isolation, that as we embody and seek to embody these practices, we are being formed in our faith. So I thank you for sharing this evening. And I want to make space for those who are uh, streaming live to post some questions. But while we wait for those questions to perhaps load up, we know that the work that I lead with the MBA is social entrepreneurship. So most of these individuals are starting NPOs, some for profit, but most importantly, they're all in the startup phase or ideation phase. So I'm curious what might be a tip for someone who is starting something, right? So they're not going into an existing organization, but they are beginning an organization. How do they work toward embedding this into the foundation of a startup?
That's a great question. I love that. I mean, I think part of it is maybe just a little bit of a reiteration on a couple of things I already said. So one, I think it's so important to think in collaboration with other people, because inevitably part of the way that sort of power and privilege works is that we miss things, right? Like there's things that we don't see in terms of how somebody else can engage with the work that we're doing, how somebody else would be able to access. So I think about language, right? Like I tend to be a person who is shocking, verbal. And one of the things that I've had to learn over the years is the importance of showing people videos, giving people physical ways to engage with the work, having translation when that's possible and when that's appropriate. I remember doing a used to do this monthly or quarterly sort of bigger group, and I remember a woman coming to this group who needed one of us to read to her. And I was like, oh, we didn't think about that. Like, we didn't think about someone with a visual impairment. And so we had to have one of our colleagues, it was a team of us facilitating, kind of sit off to the side and go through with this one particular woman. And so once that happened, I was like, okay, we're never going to let that happen again. Like, we will always ask what accommodations people need coming into the space, but I'm going to be limited by my own perspective and by my own experiences and my own power and privilege. And so being able to engage other people as thought partners as you're building things and trying to build them as accessibly. A friend colleague of mine uses the phrase, I don't think she made this up, but if you plan for the margins, that everyone else benefits. And so thinking about who is the sort of furthest away person, who is the person who would have the most difficulty accessing this service that I'm putting together, this ministry that I am building, and how do I build it in a way that will allow them to be able to access it and maximize it. It's going to be beneficial for everyone. So again, it's sort of a reiteration of some of the things I said, because that requires slowing down. That requires being in community, not being in isolation. That requires getting other people's perspectives and having other relationships and connections. And Darnell, part of why I appreciate this question so much is because it's so much easier to build it in from the beginning than it is to retrofit. So being able to kind of start from the beginning of, okay, is this place physically accessible for somebody who's in a wheelchair? Or are these chairs good for someone who's fat? Are they going to fit into these chairs and be comfortable? Is this good for a visually impaired person? How will they be able to access? And, sometimes it might be really difficult to create something that's fully accessible, but even being able to name that, right? Being able to say, there are some groups of people who are going to be excluded from this because we couldn't quite figure out how to make it as accessible as possible. But taking the time and having the sort of external inputs from the very beginning and being willing to kind of slow down are the sort of 2 or 3 things that I would say as tips for that startup phase.
Thank you. We have a question that was posed during the time that you were sharing for one of our panelists, Reverend Dr. Anthony Everett, and says, does the authenticity of those who comes to address issues of inequity help in the progress, or is it a major obstacle?
Meaning often that somebody is, I don't know if I fully understand that question. Let me look
So
at it.
yeah, okay.
Oh, I think authenticity is never an obstacle. I think it's always an important, and you can find out really quickly whether people are serious about doing the work of equity when they have to give something up. When they're willing to give something up, then you know that they are serious about the work of equity. But I think that authenticity is so key, both as a practitioner, being able to show up as my authentic self. I can recognize when a space is a space that I'm going to be able to feel comfortable in, when people are able to sort of receive me as myself. And now I guess maybe I'll pull back from that a little bit and say that I think that somebody can be authentic in wanting to create equity and also still struggle with sacrifice. So I'm not saying that means that, somebody is, if they're really about this work, then they're just going to immediately be willing to give up, whatever, because I don't necessarily think that that's the case. And I think when someone is really trying to create the best, most equitable, most inclusive experience for people, that they're workable, that you'll be able to help get them there. So I think that that is absolutely, I'm always happy to work with someone as long as I know that their heart is in the right place. And I'm like, we can deal with the rest of the stuff. Absolutely.
Great. We're going to have one final question for our keynote speaker before inviting our larger panel for more full discussion. And this is from Zane. And it says, are there any spiritual practices or resources or scriptures that you go back to as you process the fact that this work is spiritual?
Yes, a lot. So, the first thought that came to mind when I heard that question, I saw it kind of flash up on my screen, is, prayer, meditation, silence, self-reflection as practice, spiritual practices, I think are really important. I always do mindfulness with the groups that I work with and try to help them develop the skill to be able to just kind of sit with themselves and be in touch with their bodies and kind of understand what's going on and quiet their minds. So meditation, prayer, silence is a spiritual practice. Self-reflection, I think those are all spiritual practices. I will say, and I'm not going to get the scripture exactly right, but the parable of the sower is one that I come back to often, that it's my job to sow the seed. I'm not responsible for, I'm not necessarily responsible for the soil in and of itself, um, but I am responsible for sowing the seed. And I do believe that seeds produce. And that is a sort of a parable or a scripture that gives me, helps me stay faithful when I feel like I'm not really sure if what I'm doing is working or if it's effective or whatever. Being able to say, you know what, Rebecca, you have the seeds, you sowed the seeds, and they are going to, they're going to bear fruit, eventually. There's probably others that I could think of, but Zane, that was the first one that came to mind in terms of a sort of a spiritual principle. The principle of sowing seeds and reaping a harvest is something that is really important to me.
All right, we appreciate that. I want to now invite our panelists to join us on screen. From a visual standpoint, I can't see panelists, but maybe panelists are seen. Here we go. All right. Looking forward to a uh, deeper conversation on the subject of building impactful features. So I want to invite each panelist, and we'll start. Which first person is I'm sorry, my screen is doing some things. So we'll have uh, Raymond, Dr. Everett, followed by Kelly, and then Sharizna to share their name, where they are in the world, and the name of their workshop. And the workshops, for those of you who have not registered, were workshops that were pre-recorded that are accessible for you to be able to spend some time with to learn about a specific focus area on how we embody DEI. So I want them to share again the name, location, your workshop title, and as a presenter, what has come up for you in your preparation for this workshop that you created.
Thank you, Darnell. I am Raymond A. Mullings. Good evening, beautiful people. I'm coming to you live from Baltimore, Maryland, in the greater DMV area. I led the session Equity and Hiring and Contract Staff. And a lot of things came up for me as I was preparing for this session. And I want to take a moment and just share with Reverend Rebecca. I'm especially appreciative for the gems that you dropped and shared in the space. I'm feeling both excited but also affirmed by a lot of what you shared. Um, I used to work as the director of equity and anti-racism at DC Public Schools up until February when my role was cut due to the current administration. And so and then my father passed away 2 days after that. And so this year largely has been filled with emotion and despair and anger and all of those feelings that I think one should feel. And I want to go back to a question someone asked you, Rebecca, around scripture that may feel grounding in this work. And for me, it's Jeremiah 29:11. Like, I don't know the plans. Like, Lord, why did you leave me here to what seems like a dead end? And now I feel sort of forced to like almost sell out. It's like, would you take that job? And I'm like, but that's antithetical to my values or my work. And so much of that is happening around me because people need to secure their livelihood. And that's also very real for me as I'm moving back home with my parents this weekend. And so what really came up for me, was just a quote by Thurgood Marshall. And to paraphrase, it's if there's no struggle, there's no progress. And so I think about my time as an educator, a former middle school principal and elementary school teacher, and I think about the urgency that I oftentimes feel when I walk into a classroom or I'm dealing with curricular violence or any sort of system of inequity or a larger system, interlocking systems of oppression. There's always that feeling of wanting to do something about it right now, especially as an adult. Who's looking out for little children, precious children. And that's some of the tension that I felt in this space of like, I feel competent, I feel called, and driven and passionate about this work. I know it is where I'm supposed to be. And I also feel stuck. Like I can't get in the rooms, I can't sit at the tables, I can't find a seat that's big enough for me. And so as I was, preparing materials and practicing, and I always sometimes get a little fearful of I don't know what I know, or I sometimes feel like I have to be the expert instead of maybe just what's the one thing that someone might be able to pick up and take away with them. In that process, it was just to really stay firm and to stay steady and grounded in this work that what I believe we are combating did not happen overnight. It's not going to be fixed overnight. I think a lot of times in my past, I've taken an interpersonal approach to white supremacist, patriarchal, imperialist culture. And we know that those exist ideologically, institutionally, and in planes and spaces that are hard for, us in the day-to-day work that we do to really penetrate. Not that we shouldn't continue doing the really important and critical work, but understanding that there are going to be barriers to accept that. And for me, not that I'm waiting, but just being still, and really, praying and listening to the word of God. I'm also a talker. I'm not a PK, but I'm a talker. And I know there are other phenomenal folks on the panel. So I'll pause there. And thank you for the opportunity, Darnell.
Oh, I'm Anthony Everett. I'm with Alpha Management LLC. My pronouns are he, him, and ours in a progressive sense. I reside in the Osage and Cherokee lands, traditional lands of the Osage and Cherokee, and Lexington, Kentucky. I serve faith-based, justice-centered leaders and organizations by supporting transformative plans that maximizes sustainable social impact. I'm ordained clergy with retired from the United Methodist Church and also now active with the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. I assumed the director role of the Salon Project at BSK Theological Seminary, where I teach contextual ministry. And hopefully there are a bunch of my contextual ministry students on right now as a part of this particular workshop. I also teach a class entitled Prophetic Activism, Religion, and Social Justice. I come to this equity space with a background as executive director of several 501c3 nonprofit organizations, including Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, which provides restorative justice circles for justice-involved individuals and boasts of cutting Kentucky's recidivism rate by more than 50%. I've served as vice chair of the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights and a member of the Kentucky Smart on Crime Coalition. I currently serve as the chair of the steering committee for the Central Kentucky YMCA Black Achievers and a member of the board of directors of the Kentucky Coalition Against the Death Penalty, as well as a member of the Fayette County Public Schools Board of Education Equity Council Committee. So those are things that I'm involved and engaged with. I've been involved and engaged with a whole bunch of other things prior to that, but this is where my focus is right now. I'm an educator BSK Theological Seminary, but also United Theological Seminary, and also Spalding University. So I've got my hands in a number of different things. My workshop is entitled Empowering DEIB Focused Organizations, Strategies for Sustainable Impact. So if you haven't checked that out, I hope you will take some time to engage with it for about 20 or so minutes. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kelly Childress. I'm ordained with the United Church of Christ. I work in healthcare and have for 25-ish years. I've been a lifelong activist, hospital chaplain, and I work in risk now. My offering to this is entitled "From Vision to Action: Launching a DEI Initiative That Lasts." And I kind of drew on my experience just trying to launch anything in healthcare. It can be incredibly daunting. And then when you add to it something that's so fraught, especially, over decades, but especially in this historical context, even more so. And so I am an introvert, so I'm one that doesn't like talking very much, but I'm really glad to be able to be here and share with you. I'm in Portland, Oregon, and it's actually a lovely place to be, despite our president saying it's a little slice of hell. Um, you know, opinions. I think that's it for me.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Reverend Charisma Jean Marie, and I'm excited to be here with you all, some amazing colleagues here on the panel. So great to see you all. I am the Dean and Executive Director for the Disciples Divinity House in Nashville, Tennessee, and I also started a nonprofit, the Co-Conspirator Institute, where I serve as CEO. A few years ago, and part of this amazing Scent cohort, I think cohort 3, Darnell, or 2, 3, 3, yes. My workshop was building inclusive relationships. And, as a social entrepreneur in these times, one of the things that I really appreciated in preparation was just a reminder, and Reverend Rebecca said this earlier, this work is hard. And this work is necessary to do it in community. We just simply need people. And I think just the ethos of justice work is one of community. And so in building anything, you will go far depending on who you have with you, depending on who walks alongside you, who walks before you, who walks behind you. And so this notion of relationship building, inclusive relationship building, for me, it was just important to offer tools for those who are building to be able to ask explicit questions about what it means to build a team that allow me to go far, further than what I imagined and dreamed of. And so this notion of relationship building, particularly in this time, being able to understand what your ethos is, what is your core values, and how do you allow your core values to drive everything you do, including who you hire, who you build, who you select on your board. How do you allow your core values to be the driving force in how you build? I think it's important because oftentimes we can move away from the core values because we're so mission driven or we're financially driven. And I think our core values allow us to maintain our foundation. And it allows us for us to stand for whatever it is that we claim to be, and it be the driving force that allow us to go far with people in community. So I was really excited about that workshop. I built a resource for our anti-racism work. And what we noticed about that resource was it's a tool that can be used for a number of different ways. So I shared it with the folks there and just look forward to engaging you all more about it. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Yolanda Norton. I am professor of Hebrew Bible, womanist scholar, and executive director of the Global Arts and Theology Experience. It's a womanist-based nonprofit, and we do programming in different parts of the world to promote positive identity formation for Black girls and Black women. My session was developing programming with a DEI lens, and so was really excited to think about what are the ways that we can interrogate our own institutional structures and the people who are in the room um, before we develop programming, right? So one of my um, biggest pet peeves or issues is that organizations and institutions that don't properly represent a variety of different people try to um, misrepresent themselves by developing programming around DEI and often end up doing more harm than good in their desire to project something into the world that is disingenuous. And so was excited to have this kind of prompt to think about what are the questions that you need to be asking yourself before you develop any kind of programming, and who needs to be in the room before you develop programming, and how are you authentic in what your programming says about who you are as an organization, particularly coming out of higher education, really, and theological education in particular, watching institutions take DEI as a buzzword and use it to try to recruit people and build resources, particularly in this difficult time, without doing deep and meaningful work, interior work, individually and collectively, about whether or not you're equipped to be saying and doing the things that you're doing. So excited to be here. Thanks.
And I am excited as well to be able to be gathered with such a great panel of conversation partners. One thing about this role is the ability to be able to connect with good people and to do good work together. And this is definitely a reflection of the good people that I have. Some have known before this role and some I've met in this role, but always excited when I'm able to bring those voices together, that wisdom, that expertise, that we may be able to do good work together. So I'll start. Recognize we have about 30 minutes before we end our time together. So I want to make sure that we honor everyone's time and that to our panelists that we are mindful of our response times. One of the questions that we have that was submitted during registration, we gave opportunities for people who registered for seminar to pose questions. And one question I want to lift up, which I think is very much relevant for us as we think about uh, the context of DEIB work in this current political moment. So it says, how do you address misinformation in the general public regarding the work of DEIB?
I'll start. I think this is a polarizing time, and our trauma response in many ways is to run after this notion of having to respond. So I'll just say this. I think it's important for us to stay focused on the work that you were called to do and let the work speak for itself. Let the work stand for itself. We can't chase after all of this misinformation. As much as misinformation is out there, if you focus on your work, then the proper information will also be out there. And the truth is, people who want to know truth, who want to know and do the work of justice and live in love, they'll find your work. But they can't find your work because it's not there if you're constantly chasing after responding to all this misinformation. So the best way to respond, I would suggest, is to do your work. Do the work that your soul must have, and let that be your response.
I want to echo Shariza's response. One of the kind of flagship program for our nonprofit is the Beyonce Mass. And so we got a lot of press and media, and most of that press and media around that project, I'll say is just inaccurate, right? So there's a lot of things on the internet, uh, posts from people on Facebook, social media, right? Responding to their perceptions of the work that we're doing. And by and large, I ignore it, right? Like I, our stance is we're gonna put out the information that correctly reflects the work that we're doing. And when people are naysayers or want to like offer a negative narrative about that work, we just ignore it. If the space is not for you, um, why am I wasting my time, right? And energy? We all have limited time and energy, and in the kind of particular climate that we are in, the way that these kinds of oppressions persist is you wear people out. So I'm only going to focus on what's mine so that I have the energy to do the work that is mine. So it really does require, to Rizna's point, that you have a kind of tunnel vision that says, this work is too important. The people that I care about are too important to focus on people who intend me, the mission of my organization, and the communities that are important to me harm.
Thank you both for sharing a response. Now I want to ask the question, what are some stories of institutional transformation that you've seen as it relates to the work of DEIB work? And don't necessarily think large scale, it could be micro steps going slow, but what are moments that you hold as like moments of transformation, moments where you're seeing the will of progress in an institutional setting, organizational setting?
I'm gonna just go ahead and jump in and be really
Thank you. Okay,
honest
all
and,
right.
and brief. And I would say nowhere, right? And so, for me, like when you started to ask the question, I thought, oh, dang, I don't know that I can answer this question. Um, I don't see institutions changing. What I see is people changing, right? And so for me, the DEI work is about how do I provide resources and space for people who have to exist in these institutions that are determined to be steady in their oppressive behavior, right? What I appreciate about that is that the kinds of institutions that I work in and around, I'm watching them die because they won't move. And I believe that death is a natural part of any ecosystem. So I'm glad those institutions are dying and people are thriving even as those institutions are dying because it means that God's work is still persistent.
I similarly, Yolanda, thank you for saying this being like nowhere. That's so real. I worked for a number of years at the nonprofit arm of a pretty significantly sized church in Boston. And I started during the course of my time there, I started a consulting arm within that organization. And we transitioned over the course of that time from a white executive director to a Black woman executive director. And that was not victorious. That executive director ended up actually pushing me out as another Black woman and, causing a lot of harm. And while I was going through the sort of trauma of trying to figure out what to do and how to, I ended up having lunch with the previous executive director, and I was like, I just kind of feel like everything that we worked to do, that it was, like it's for naught. And she said, no, every person that you worked with, every consultant, look at what they're doing. They're doing it somewhere else, but they're taking the lessons that you all learned, the work that you all designed together, and they're spreading it out into the world. And similar to what you were just saying, Dr. Norton, she said, this is a natural part of the life cycle. Things come, they grow, they die, things get buried, and they, grow as other things. And it was so, and this was a woman who was responsible for that. She was the founding director. And so for her to be able to have a level of peace about watching something that she had, put together, be able to sort of be falling apart, I was like, okay, it took me some time. It took a long time. And, the other thing I want to say sort of related to that is that I had a colleague who, as I was trying to figure out what to do and how to, make my own shift, she said, what do you want your legacy to be? And I said, the people. I want to be able to have worked and lived in a way that we are all still connected, and we are. And so a couple years later, I can look back at that and say that work that we did around restorative justice, around trauma inclusion, around racial equity, we bonded over that and we connected over that. And with everything else that went around it, those relationships stayed to the point. So to the point of the people, and the people are changing and they're moving and they're growing and they're taking the lessons and taking them to different places and transforming and doing in their different work. But I also think that that's part of Adrienne Marie Brown is somebody who I pay a lot of attention to, and she talks about emergent strategy, and she talks about the importance of sort of sowing seeds and doing, like, I think she says small is all. And that can be really hard to hold on to, but remembering that our work does happen in the in-between, in the relationships with people, and that they then kind of go and do more work and plant more seeds.
Thank you both for sharing that. I really appreciate small is all. So when we think about this work lived out in the everyday life of organizations, and it happens through people, right? People making decisions, people changing their framework and how they choose to engage. Let's talk about hiring. Specifically, we'll think about social entrepreneurs. Many of them are hiring people who are freelancers, maybe not ready to necessarily hire a W-2 employee, but that time will come. So I want to kind of speak to it from that level and then into the level when organization begins to grow. How does equity look in hiring contract staff and then eventually uh, W-2 full-time, part-time staff? Frame, I know you kind of talked about that. So give us some insights on equity in hiring.
Sure. In my experience, it has not been in the social or corporate responsibility space, largely more corporate organizations, period, education, and in the healthcare space. Um, I, I yeah, I'm gonna speak to a feeling. I don't know that I'm right to jump this question off.
That's fine. Yeah, exactly. We can always make a pivot there. So does anybody else feel like they have something to offer to that particular question?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I will give the example, and this is an example of a friend of mine, pastor in New Jersey, who has a food pantry at their church. Church maybe have 15 members, but they feed um, well over 1,000 people on a regular basis. And so this particular food pantry, one of the things that they found is that they had people that they hired at the church to actually facilitate, giving out the food. And the pastor heard back from the Black mothers in the community, that they're not getting what they need, and all the things that are happening that were inequitable, in terms of giving out, and they thought it was some malfeasance that might have been taking place with the people who were hired on. And so what they did is a flip, and they hired those sisters that were in that community to actually do the work, and it's been a tremendous change in that work. I think that, when we talk about hiring people that actually have the experience of being in situations that others are experiencing at this time, is extremely important. And it doesn't it makes a world of difference when you have someone who has walked the walk and now can talk the talk as opposed to someone who is, well, I like to do that, and that hasn't had that experience, hasn't been involved with it. So I think that's very important, and that you're making sure that those individuals truly have identity with the community that they are purportedly to be serving.
Jump in as well. I'd like to use the word language shared values. I think it's important when you are hiring, whether it's a vendor, a contractor, or an employee, that you are having conversations with yourself and others who are part of the hiring process to talk about what you value. And so that when you put a post out, a job post out, it's there, right? When you're having conversations with during the interview process, it's there. I'm going to constantly say throughout the night, your core values ought to be your driving force. What you believe, that should be the foundation by which you do everything, including hiring. So making that clear, just as much as Darnell will tell you, your mission got to be clear, your core values must be clear, because your core values is the ethos by which you do your work. It becomes the personality, it becomes the foundation, it becomes the spirit by which you do the work. And so if you are not clear with your core values, you'll hire people, put people in place around the need, but then the culture, because that's what you're really trying to establish, right? Nurture, foster a kind of culture that reflects the work. And too many, to go back to the question that Yolanda had to be a prophet and stand up and say nowhere. Institutions can't be transformed because the culture does not reflect oftentimes the work that's put out there, right? So we have a whole lot of justice oriented work, organizations that's doing the work, but inside their culture does not reflect the product that they put out, because we're chasing after this performative work and not really trying to be transformative within, right? Because we have not been clear about what we value. So it is important to be clear. Just as much as your mission is clear, your core values must be clear, and it needs to walk hand in hand in every decision you make.
I wanted to
I,
make sure.
oh,
Oh,
sorry.
go
Go
ahead,
on,
Reverend.
Raymond.
Now go.
Okay. So what you just said, what you were just preaching, Dr. Charisma, that resonates so deeply with my spirit. One of the things that I often say is let the beauty you love be what you do. Like if you're chasing equity outside, you can't be inequitable inside. That's not integrity. That's not a house that will stand. But the other thing that I wanted to say, responding to Reverend Dr. Everett, or not responding, but kind of adding, is that I've also seen when we hire people who have lived experience, they sometimes don't have the quote unquote professional experience, and therefore they require more support. And so when we hire people like that, we also have to be prepared to give them the support they need to do the job, because I think what can happen sometimes is it's like, well, we tried that and they never came to work on time, or they didn't do this, or they didn't do that. And it's like, well, but you didn't give them what they needed. You didn't scaffold, you didn't give them the support, you didn't give them the supervision. It is so important for us to have people with lived experience doing the work, but I find that we sometimes let them get burned out. Because we don't give the sort of the backside, I don't even want to say it like that, of lived experience. What we value of that is the connection and the camaraderie, but that can also wear on people, right? Many of us we're doing this work because it's personal. It's also exhausting. And if I'm in the trenches every day and I can relate to, I remember what it was like to be hungry, and I remember what it's like to still be on drugs, and I remember what it was like to, bury my son to gun violence. It's personal work, and it requires tending by the organization, by the leadership, not just the sort of the be able to check the box. So we have people with lived experience. We got to support them, and they might need support in non-traditional ways, and we have to be prepared to offer that to them so that they can really thrive in those roles.
I won't belabor the point. I wanted to make sure that folks could speak more directly to the social entrepreneurship piece. And also, Reverend Rebecca, as a male, I will always create space for those who do not share my maleness. So I appreciate you, going ahead and jumping in.
Okay, so as we think about, again, the practical sides, the life of organizations, whether they're nonprofits or even for profit, I'm curious, this is more perhaps a Kelly question, Reverend Kelly. We think about cultures that already exist, and they're saying, hey, we want to take this first step in our process of creating some type of initiative or creating some type of equity task force. What are the wisdom that you offer people who are like, we want to do something institutionally, we don't know where to begin?
It's also huge. I think, and everything that's already been said speaks to this really well, probably better than I could. But I go back, I learned a change management process, which is the acronym is ADKAR. It's awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. So, like, understanding that everyone who's human is resistant to change, usually at least in some level, some more than others for various reasons. Um, but it's not, it's a normal reaction to somebody being confronted with, let's change something. And then multiply that by a million when it's something that is a deeply held thing that people are very afraid about or don't understand or whatever. So part of it is building the awareness. And I think in building the awareness goes back to something that Reverend Rebecca was talking about, which is building trust. We can't move faster than the trust is built. So building awareness and building trust, awareness of why is this something that we need to do or might want to do, and and helping people kind of come up to some level of shared understanding about that. And for others, it could take a lot more time. It could be a lot more difficult to kind of break through the bias, the unconscious bias. I know for as a white person, sort of, I don't know, it wasn't like a moment that I realized it was like Neo in the Matrix, the um, the facade came off and I could start to actually see the programming all around and how that's so hard to see. It's like you can't see the water when you're the fish. We all know it's the same kind of thing. So, but then once you start to see it, for me, it was like, I want to see more and more and more. Um, so part of it is that building that awareness and the trust that goes along with it. And then the desire for the change. And part of that comes from sharing stories, I think. Because, when we confront people, want to debate them, talk about the misinformation and all that, that's important. And there are people that can do that really well. I'm not one of them because I get very tongue-tied, but the the desire can be born out of sharing personal stories. Like, here's how this impacted me. This is how it's impacted my friends. This is how it's impacting the people that I care about. Like, yeah, I don't know those people, but I care about them. And this is how it's affecting them. Imagine your child being taken away from you and kind of getting to the heart of it, to build some more desire on the part of somebody that is sort of unaffected to say, well, wait a minute, maybe I don't feel comfortable just sitting back here and saying this isn't about me. So there's that desire piece. And then knowledge, building up people's knowledge about what, where, why, when, who, how, which is even harder now, obviously, since uh, real history, which has never been taught in our public schools, is now any kind of inkling to try and teach that is being, ripped away. So it gets even more difficult, but still building knowledge, the ability. Somebody was saying before, like, if you don't, the scaffolding, if you don't provide the scaffolding, then, Reverend Rebecca, then we're sort of setting people up to fail. So giving them the ability to do that. And then the reinforcement, something that just kills me about anti or unconscious bias work and DEI work is that I see a lot of organizations who are like, well, let's just have this class or go to this PowerPoint presentation or do, this one thing. That's a guarantee for failure. We're talking about culture change. That is not going to happen by somebody going to a class one time and then it's never talked about again. There's no accountability. There's no checking in with people, nothing. So I think those are some of the most important things. And now I've lost myself in my train of thought. So hopefully I answered that.
Beautifully said. We appreciate it. Raymond, did you want to offer something else?
Sure. Kelly, you are sparking all the thoughts for me.
Okay.
I really appreciate you bringing up the ADKAR change model. As a organizational psychologist and practitioner, when I'm in that consulting cycle, one of the things that I'm curious about is the why. And you spoke about like change, and change is grief. And a lot of times we're asking folks to do things differently and things that they may not be good at or used to or quite understand, or now I'm not going to get the same attention or the privilege I have is lost or whatever. And I think a lot of times organizations who are not clear, and I think Reverend, is it Jean-Marie, talked about this, or that's the thing I'm walking away with, the values. They're not really clear on their values and their North Star. And so what is a desire to respond or meet the moment, we need to have this to be competitive or to be attractive, or to show that we're living our values, oftentimes falls flat. And I think from an organizational sense is a waste of money. And then the narrative is people don't care about these initiatives. When maybe the content, the facilitation, the modality, the fact that we're not, you talked about, or there's like the knowledge and awareness piece of that change model, but folks are not bought in. And what we're trying to do for them is the wrong approach. Like we should be doing that with them, and really be responding to the needs of folks in the organization that in align to the functions of their role, but also in service of organizational goals and strategies, overarching values. Like I really love that. And I'm walking away. That's like the takeaway I'm walking away with. But I appreciate you sharing that because for me, it made all of those thoughts come together in my head as I think about my experience of organizations who have been able to do this work successfully, whether it's like professional development or an affinity group, an ERG, a learning course, or what's really popular right now. Like micro credentials, equity and anti-racism courses as micro credentials for like potential pathways to promotion. Like some of that is here's how we are going to get talent excited about getting to the next level. And here's how, all under the guise of capitalism, but here's what we're going to make folks think we are giving or doing for them. I also feel like I'm talking in circles, so I'm gonna pause there.
Oh, good conversation. I want to definitely honor the time of our presenters. We're coming toward the end of our time together. So we have one question from the chat, but as a way of preparing presenters for final thoughts, we're talking about building an impactful future. I want you, as your final thought, after this question is responded to offer people this prompt. Uh, I want to invite you into the next step that we take together in building an impactful future by doing blank. Maybe a resource, maybe a book, maybe an action, but you're inviting them into their next step and helping us together build an impactful future that embodies the work of DEIB. This question I want to pose to uh, Reverend Norton, and we can have one other person respond before we go into our final thoughts. And it says, what is the responsibility does the church have in preparing its people to live like Christ, especially in a way that embrace true diversity, equity, and inclusion? So the role of the church in this work.
I think that's a great question. I think the role of the church is to be prophetic, to be a leading arm and not a trailing arm. And that really requires the church to um, divest itself of some of its institutionalism, and to return to some core principles, right? So um, I think a lot of what we see the church doing in kind of 19th, 20th, 21st century is um, trying to cultivate power. And that is antithetical to the model that we see in scripture, but maybe congruent with every model of Christianity that follows. And so I think we have a real question to ask about how do we use our resources differently? How do we bring people together differently? And I mean that it counter to the way that we often talk about it, right? So we often talk about 11 o'clock on Sunday as the most segregated hour as problematic. Um, and I don't think it's problematic, right? So for me as a Black woman, being in the Black church is some of the only kind of sacred, safe or space that I get to walk into. Now, I say safer because patriarchy is real in the Black church, right? For my LGBTQ siblings, heteroaggression is real in the Black church. But if 6 days a week, white supremacy is on my tail, and really like 6 days and 22 hours, give me my 2 hours. Like, let me have my space of actual sanctuary, right? So I'm not talking about that, but it is a question of how will you divest yourself of power? How do you, one of the biggest questions that we're running into in theological education right now is, is institutions closing, right? So the Association of Theological Schools said 20 to 30% of all theological institutions would close within the next 20 to 30 years. And rather than seeing that as a gift, to Sharizna's point, to double down on somebody's values, to say, who are we going to be in this next generation? These white supremacist institutions said, no, I deserve to be the one that survives. Right? And so they compromise their integrity and their mission, and they merge with other institutions that are not congruent with their values, just for the sake of continuity, right? Just for the sake of folks who have tenure being able to make it to retirement, right? So rather than saying, let's give those financial resources to churches and communities who can do good work and let's die gracefully, we hear just a lot of death rattles. And I think that I bring that up because that's the same thing that's happening in the church. There are too many churches that are opening on Sunday and nobody's there because you're not saying anything and you're not doing anything. So how is your faithful witness to say, let's close our doors and take the resources we have and commit them to somebody, or some institution that can do better, can do more, and who might not have some of the isms that are keeping us from being missional. And so for me, that's the work of the church, is to say, where do we need to make hard decisions and acquiesce power so that other more fruitful, generative ministries and missions can live in this world.
Man. Well, with that being said, I think that is a good way to move us into our closing remarks. And it's just a one sentence prompt that your invitation is XYZ. And this invitation is what we're inviting ourselves. We're inviting those who will listen to these recordings at a later time into a particular practice that we believe will be a foundation into building a more impactful future. So we can start in the same order that we did our introduction. So we'll actually start with our keynote speaker. Then we'll be followed by my orders all off. Just do popcorn. Go ahead,
We got you.
Reverend Jackson.
Okay. My first thought was to be still. That's my word. And my resource is Rest is Resistance by Tricia Hersey.
I am also in that stillness space and leaving with slow is smooth and smooth is fast.
I would go with that. I think that there has to be some action that takes place. It has to be prophetic. It has to be action that is thought through strategically and is inclusive of our rest and our healing alongside of actually doing and transforming. I would say there's a book by Sidney Williams called Fishing Differently that I would use as a resource.
I would say cultivate joy and do a lot of deep breathing. And for white people doing or trying to be involved in anti-racist work, let go of looking for a safe space. Just try and be brave and be with what's actually really happening. And do your deep breathing.
I would say And I agree, it's action. So for me, I would say, as you reflect and write down what you want to do, it is just as important that you write down what you value. What do I value? What matters? Write it down and allow it to be a working document because that should grow, it should evolve, it should change. And find some people you trust and have them sit with that with you. What do you, I think that's a very prophetic question in this hour for everyone. What do I value? And how do what I value and what I want to do come together?
I'm going to echo Kelly's words about the importance of joy in these seasons, right? So I think, again, when we're fighting all of these fires, it's really easy to think that all of the meaning comes in the work and in the struggle. And so I'm a visual person, so this is my book. It's called Joy is My Justice, right? And so I think our laughter, our ability to be communal, our the moments when we can really kind of tune into that joy are really thumbing our noses at the systems that would try to like fray us unto death.
Amen, friends. The invitation is clear, and the invitation has been shared to us all that we may all work together to create a more just and loving world for all that works for everybody and not just some folks. So, friends, thank you to our panelists, our keynote speaker. We want to invite you to join us next week for part two, our final week of Sense Seminar. Above, may we continue to sit with all that has been said, that we may go slow together. Go in peace, friends. Good night.